Our second speaker from ngā Toki Whakarururanga is Aroha Mead. I have to put my glasses on. I'm going to read a little intro for Aroha. Yeah, Aroha, I'm going to read an intro. Aroha, you're an independent Māori researcher, specialising in mātauranga Māori, Indigenous knowledge and biocultural heritage, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property policy and law and biotechnology and conservation. And Aroha's worked across many sectors, including public policy, academia, journalism, iwi and Māori organisations, as well as the national and the international NGO space. She's a leader, a shining light in this area. I first met Aroha in the late 80s, early 90s, around the Mātātua Declaration. Yourself and Moana Jackson came to Lincoln University. There were only 4 Māori students in a class called Tino Rangatiratanga, and our lecturer had brought you down, both of you. So we were treated to the most amazing intellectual conversations and to the politics right at the time of protecting Indigenous and Māori cultural, intellectual and property rights. Aroha no mai hara mai.
Tuatahi he mihi ana ki ngā haukainga, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, having to go after Annette Sykes is no easy thing to do. But it absolutely warms my heart to see this place full. To see that the issues that we're talking about today are of interest to a much wider group than the small sort of numbers that we usually get to talk to. But I wanted to start by just saying that in the year that I was born, I'm not going to tell you the year, but the year I was born, there were 113 countries in the world. Today, there are 195. So that increase in number, it hasn't come because there's been a new generation of Captain Cooks that have explored the world and found new lands. It isn't because new lands have suddenly appeared from the ocean. That's all about reconfiguring, reclaiming, renaming, and regaining sovereignty of countries and peoples that were colonised. It's been a massive global project, and that project isn't finished. 195 countries, that isn't the end. There are still at least 20 or 30 coming up. So when people say that sovereignty doesn't matter, or when they say the past doesn't matter and that we should just get on with it and focus on the issues, I always look at the world map, because this represents the struggles of peoples all around the world to be seen, to be heard, to stand their own ground as an equal sovereign nation alongside other sovereign nations. So as we see that reconfiguration of the world, which includes not only new countries being formed, but former republics or former, like the USSR, comes down to 14 new countries. We see countries in the Pacific, in particular, gaining their independence. All of that happened during my lifetime. And then we see right here in Aotearoa a reclaiming. When I was, When I was sort of a student at school there, and we learnt about Māori, there was something like 30 iwi. Now, if you look at statistics, it says that there's over 100. Nobody can confidently actually state how many iwi there are in New Zealand. It's very fluid, and it's because we're going through that same metamorphosis that's happened in the world. We are also reclaiming sovereignty, and we are reclaiming from whānau to become hapu, from hapu to become iwi, and our numbers haven't finished yet either. In fact, we're probably just beginning. There's a lot of work that we're going to be seeing in the future. But when I look at, I'm having troubles with this button. When I look at what's going on in our lives right now, all the seriousness of the issues that we have to contend with, I don't actually allow myself to go into this space very often. Hearing a minister be proud because, she's the first space minister in the world, as if this is something to be truly amazed at. Wanting to bring back GM with no knowledge of any of the background of the technology, or not aware of any of the science around it. It's not a good space to be in, like you sort of put your head out and you see it and then you think, ugh, I can't contend with it. Then you have a Māori Minister of Foreign Affairs who's declared to the world not only non-support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also instructing their officials, the diplomats, to just step back altogether from supporting Indigenous rights in the international arena. It can be a depressing place. So I choose not to stay in a depressing place. I choose not to just be angry, but to go to somewhere that is my inspiration, that enables me to take my place and be able to contribute to the future with a purpose. And that's, if I was to sort of put a context to it, it would be the work of my sister, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, in decolonising methodologies, the Indigenous project, the People's Project that we're all involved in, around reclaiming, renaming, reframing, restoring, but also recovering. And recovering is also about ourselves and being able to deal with just generations and generations of trauma. So the place that I go to is the Mātātua Declaration. And my talk also has a poll. It's got 3 questions, and you have to go into your app to answer these questions. There's no right or wrong answer to these questions. It's just that you give a really good opportunity to get a feel for your awareness of 3 instruments that are referred to all the time in this area of work. So the first instrument is the Mātātua Declaration on the Cultural and Intellectual Property Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For those of you who have an app, please go into the poll and just let us know, have you ever heard of this declaration before? Your answers will help kind of work out how much effort we should put into capacity building or just letting people know more about the issues. Also, because we're about to come up to the 30th commemoration of this declaration, we have an event next month, May 14th and 15th in Whakatāne, to just relive the moment and look also at the impact and the future. What I want to say in particular about, so go to the poll please and answer this question. I'm really having problems with this thing. Okay. So 1993 was 2 years after my father's iwi Ngāti Awa tabled Y46, which was the Ngāti Awa claim. And even in the midst of trying to work through the tribunal process for a claim from a raupatu iwi, the leadership of the Runanga at that time saw the value of being able to convene in Whakatāne an international meeting on Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights. And when you think about the capacity of our Runanga, our iwi authorities today, I really want you to think back to that time in the early 1990s, the foresight, the vision, the strength of character required to make a commitment of this kind and to be willing to do it. So there is a long story about why Ngāti Awa decided to do it, and has everything to do with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But we'd heard about this notion of intellectual property rights but didn't understand it. And the beauty to me of the coming together of the iwi and Indigenous peoples globally to talk about the issues in a safe space was to admit what we don't know, but just to understand that this is something that matters and we need to learn about it and we need to know why it's an issue for us. So half the challenge of learning something is admitting that you don't know. And it's very, very problematic for some people to admit what they don't know, but the iwi did. And the way they organised this conference is that the 9 iwi at the time, there's now 13 iwi of Mātātua, but the 9 iwi all took turns at hosting. So the very first day was in Ngāti Awa at Kokohino Marae, and that was looking at Mātauranga Māori. And our speakers included Moana Jackson and Graham Hingangaro Smith and my father. And we had, would have been around 150 at this meeting. So as we travelled to the different iwi, we'd have new groups of people. So all in all, we probably would have had over 400 in 1993 talking about cultural intellectual property rights. We had a meeting at Tōrere Marae. That one was on environmental, that was on the ocean. So every year we got to choose which topic they wanted to focus on. And we also went to Ruatahuna, and that's where we looked at the realm of tāne, biodiversity and biotechnology. And the Y262 claim, we had Murray Parsons, who came to support Dal Wihongi. And that was her, sort of the first international airing of the claim. And then we went to Ngaiterangi, the realm of Rehia, and that was an incredible day. We probably had more than 300 people who showed up for that one. I'm showing you the photos, I'm showing you all the faces, I'm showing you the places, because I want you to understand that this is why this is my inspiration, and why I don't really feel the need to look to other things, because I got my mandate from participating in this, and I have devoted the rest of my life to honouring this declaration because of all the people who came behind it. So we eventually came up with a Mātātua declaration. We wrote it overnight. We translated it into Spanish and Māori overnight. We presented it to the hui at Kokohino. In those days, we did it on one of those overhead projectors, It projected onto a sheet on the wall. That's how sophisticated we were. And that's also how the Mātātua Declaration came to be. So what is it about this declaration? I mean, if I look at it now, for all that I know, would I write it differently? Absolutely. But it's that it represents that time and those people. And what is most important for me as I spend my life promoting the declaration is really the preamble, which is about acknowledging that the loss of our ability to maintain and to have decisions around the treasures of our ancestors is that to have lost that through colonisation is a global experience of Indigenous peoples. It's something we all have in common. It's absolutely part of the package you get when you are colonised. Your lands are taken, your resources are taken, but so are those deeper levels of your cultural understandings. Those too can be severely eroded. Also that it makes clear that the first beneficiaries, the people that matter the most in making any future decisions, are the people who descend from those who created. And that we did all create the notion that Indigenous people somehow, through the gods, created a marae with all the carvings and no one owns it. That notion that there weren't individuals who have stories, who had a whole background inherited from the generation before, passed on to the generation after. But that really clarifies it in the whole busy landscape of talking about intellectual and property rights. You bring it right back to the place, to the people, to the creators. And that's who you start with, not national down. There are also recommendations that were made for governments, for the United Nations, and I can say that 30 years on, most of the recommendations made to ourselves, to Indigenous peoples, we have met. To some degree, the international community has met some of those recommendations, but on the national level, very little has changed. So after we had the conference, a group of Mātātua elders came with me to the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which was at that time drafting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was presented there, and the many Indigenous peoples from around the world signed the declaration at that time. It was presented to the UN, it became part of the sort of history of how Indigenous peoples globally have responded to the issues of intellectual property. And it's the first thing I ever look for when I see a publication about Indigenous intellectual property. If the Mātātua Declaration isn't referenced in the bibliography, then I know that the writer hasn't done a full job of researching. So the second poll question is, have you heard of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Because you hear us talk about it a lot. That's a whole other journey and a whole other story, but just want to find out how many of you are familiar with the UN Declaration. We're going to get the answers at the end. So this is us presenting the presentation. It was done in English and Spanish. The bottom photo, that's of Evarista Nuquart from Koika, which is the coordinating organisation of Indigenous peoples from the Amazon basin. And our kōrero was presented with 4 speakers, and the challenge we had in having the UN system be able to recognise 4 consecutive speakers was a real issue. We started with Moai Tihi from Tūhoi, who gave the opening karakia. And then when he finished his 3 minutes, I'd put the speaking order down, but they went to somebody else. So we then had to negotiate, no, it's me. So put it on me to do the English. And then when I finished, they again gave it to someone else. And by this time, the whole Indigenous caucus had cottoned on to what was happening. So they all came and stood, or many came and stood behind us to make clear this is the speaking order. So myself in English, Evaristo in Spanish, and then Joe Mason gave the closing karakia. So that's how we were able to get that declaration through. I don't expect you to see this, but these are all the signatories, not only of the Indigenous organisations overseas, but we brought it back home to the National Māori Congress. And most of the iwi, there were 45 iwi of Congress, signed it. So there is indeed what you would have to say is a mandate. I wasn't sure whether Vandana was going to be in the room or not, but one of the amazing things that happens when you do get involved in Indigenous processes is that you get involved in UN processes and international issues. And the first time that I ever met Vandana Shiva was in about 1994 in a meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity. There is an article that refers to Indigenous and local communities, and no one understood what is meant by this notion of local communities. There's a whole political reason that it's used, but we brought together all those from the Third World Network who had spent their lives fighting for farmers' rights, and the campesina movement of Mexico for peasants' rights, and they wanted to know, do they fit in this convention? Is this about them, or is it only about Indigenous peoples? So it was actually a really pivotal meeting. And it, of course, wasn't up to us as this group of individuals, but I'll never forget that conversation, because it was done in earnest when you are from people who are marginalised, struggling to be heard, and then you see wording that could possibly include you, but you don't know. How do you navigate that conversation? So all of this to say that how we approach all the different issues that are happening for us really is about standing our ground. But standing our ground doesn't always mean that you have to be out there protesting. That is an important role, and there are times when you will feel that that is absolutely the direction you have to take. Standing your ground, though, is also doing the opposite of what globalisation and capitalism wants. Because the opposite of that, of course, is self-sufficiency. It's localisation. To do that is a silent act of protest, but it is the most effective act. It is ultimately where we all need to pivot to. The more self-sufficient we are, the more we don't rely on other economies, the world market, the more we're able to feed ourselves good food and feed our children and nurture ourselves with the values that matter to us. That is the antithesis of the very thing that we're fighting against. And so although there's lots of doom and gloom, I choose hope. As a nanny, you have to, because why would you want anything less than hope for your mokopuna? I was asked by Jessica to talk about GMOs, and it's such a problematic area to talk about, but what I did want to say is that I spend most of my work in the international arena, looking at policy at that global level. And what I've noticed in the past decade is this very deliberate strategy to keep changing the name. So genetic modification, we all know it, because the whole world galvanised around protesting GMOs. It's confident ground. We say that term, we understand what it is, and so off we go and we can do a response. But when you talk to the scientists, they keep using different terms, and then you sit there thinking, so is that GMOs? Is gene editing the same as GMOs? Is genetic engineering the same? De-extinction, what's that? So one of the things that's happened at the global level is the adoption of this term synthetic biology. This term synthetic biology is meant to get rid of all this noise around these different names. It's to be really clear, it's one field, and if we're going to develop policy around this field, that's where we aim. We don't try and be smart and try and keep up with the changing names that are being used for genetic modification. You pick the umbrella, you pick the top level. And at the CBD level, and within IUCN, which is another organisation I'm involved in, International Union for Conservation of Nature, this is the term that's used. Interestingly, though, I've tried to bring that term into the New Zealand policy context, and the resistance I get is quite phenomenal. And it kind of brings back all the bad memories I have of when we first got involved in fighting GM, because there's this body of scientists, mostly male, and they don't want this word. They do not want to use synthetic biology. They like to play with, because then you see, when you have to go down to detail, it's actually a ego boost for the scientists, because they can tell whether you know every little thing about the difference between CRISPR and CRISPR-Cas and gene editing. There's no reason for you to know all that difference. You just need to know the general principles from which that science is based. So synthetic biology, there's a lot of work that's been done, and I'm just going to share with you an example of a process. The only reason I'm sharing it with you is to give you hope to see that it is possible to insist on and get a process that can work to develop a policy around something as controversial as GMs. But here comes the third and final question. Have you heard of this Convention on Biological Diversity? It came out of the Earth Summit in 1993. New Zealand signed it and ratified it. It's been part of New Zealand policy since that time, but New Zealand hasn't followed all of the rules of the CBD, because they also include a protocol around access and benefit sharing of genetic resources and associated mātauranga. The process that I want to share with you is with IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. So this is a member-based organisation. It comprises governments as well as NGOs, and it has a separate caucus, a separate membership category for Indigenous peoples. New Zealand is a member of IUCN. There was a working group established back in 2016 to develop a policy for IUCN on the role of synthetic biology in conservation. And there is such a mistrust of the science and scientists that the policy and the working group had to shut down because no one trusted the advice. So then they came back with a new process, and this new process has a citizens' assembly of people from around the world who, in order to be in the assembly, you actually have to not know about synthetic biology. You have to be able to just receive messages and then interpret the way that most people anywhere in the world would do that. And that citizens' assembly, it gives advice to a policy working group. I'm on that working group. The nature of the working group is that the majority members had to be non-Western. They are scientists, but they're non-Western trained scientists. And the reasoning behind that is that people felt that there's been too many cases of processes where Western trained scientists haven't been able to, one, acknowledge that they carry values, and certainly, number two, haven't been able to separate their values from the science. So the way to circumvent that is to actually get a group where the majority members are scientists who aren't trained through the Western universities. They've got their degrees from their home countries, so it's mostly developing countries. And we're going through a process now of developing this policy. I want to bring this to you because New Zealand is going to go through its own process shortly, since the Minister has declared that she wants GMOs to be out there. allowing scientists to do their thing. And sometimes when you're in these situations where you're getting things forced on you, you need to know that there are alternatives. So this is why I'm just showing you this. It's not because I think it's the most amazing process, it has flaws, but it's just to say that you can insist on another way, and that at a global level there is increased awareness that the science can't be trusted from certain sectors of society because they're just too invested in the technology. And furthermore, at the global level, all the research has shown that the unintended consequences of any kind of GMO is still unknown to such an extent that it has to be considered high risk. Anything has to be considered high risk. That's what the science at the global level says. Trying to get that science into the national level, however, is a whole other journey. So I'm just going to come back to where we all are as people, as whānau, that this is the place that we have to figure out what our priorities are. I think Annette said it really well, we have different roles, some in the front, some in the back. Don't feel the burden of thinking you have to carry everything, because you just don't. But one of the joys of being part of a movement is that you see and meet who else is doing other things, and you support them to do those things so you can do what you're good at. There is such a diverse range of problems that we're facing, particularly now under this government. None of us needs to shoulder the burden of that. We just need to be together to collectivise, strategise, and be clear in our focus. Find your happy place. My happy place is the Mātātua Declaration, because I feel all those tipuna who passed on, who participated, but all the ones who are still here, I feel them with me. And I know that as long as I'm in that journey, I'm fine. You find your happy place too. Hopefully for many of you it's the Mātātua Declaration, it's the treaty, because these things have weight, they have meaning, they have mana, and they actually give you inspiration when you're in a tough place and you have to make a decision. You can come back to these words that our tipuna left for us. And I'm only 6 minutes over. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.